Assalamu alaikum and good night. Today is the seventh day of our book narration. Book is Power and Politics in Project Management by Jeffrey K. Pinto. And I am Suhail Iqbal narrating this book. So far, we have covered up till chapter number 8. We are about to finish the chapter 8 and chapter 7, and then we'll move on to the chapter 8. So today our target is to reaching almost at the mid of chapter 8, and tomorrow we'll be finishing chapter 8 and chapter 9. Tomorrow will be the last day of the narration. So let's move on. In chapter 8, in negotiation skills, we were talking about dealing with problem negotiators, and in that we have discussed extreme demands, we have discussed escalating demands, we have discussed lock-in tactics, and today we are going to start talking about. So here it starts. On the top of the page, good cop bit is to use a negotiating team in which one member acts belligerent, bellicose, and whose role is to be confrontational. As part of this, he will also set high demands and posture as though unwilling to consider alternatives. The partner adopts the mean of the soul of reasonableness, sometimes even publicly chastising his partner before turning apologetically back to other negotiating party. The good cop's job is to reason with the other side, offering some moderate concession as opposed to the extreme demand, and expect the other party to be so appreciative of his candor they will accept the marginally more reasonable offer. In effect, good cop, bad cop is classic manipulation using the tactic of multiple points of pressure to influence the other side. Good cop, bad cop, even when recognizable, is surprisingly effective. To avoid unpleasant exchanges with the bad cop, we quickly latch on and engage in dialogue with the good cop, exactly what the other party is working for. The bad cop's role is to be nothing more than an agent provocateur. He serves as a goad, pushing the opponent into conversations with his more accessible partner. It is important to look beyond this fairly transparent trick and see the position the other party is adopting. The giveaway is to listen carefully to the good cop, who is the true spokesperson for the group. It is often the good cop who has authority to make the final deal, and it should be to this person that most conversation is directed. Negotiate without emotion or giving in to the jibes of the bad cop. Next is take it or leave it. Always lurking in the background of negotiations is the desire to close as quickly and painlessly as possible. Some opponents prefer to play their own game. Some opponents prefer to play their own game of hardball, which consists of offering a drop dead position from which they insist they will not retreat. The benefits and drawbacks are obvious: big wins and big failures. The risks are concomitantly large. When you draw a line in the sand, you are entering into a game in which you gamble the other party needs the deal more than you. In some situations, particularly if you have done your homework, you may be correct. For example, you may discover the other side is in financial straits, forcing them to offer major concessions. On the other hand, take it or leave it is not negotiation per se. It does not allow for problem solving or mutual win-win outcomes, and should be used rarely and then only when you believe you hold the winning hand. How do you deal with take it or leave it positions? First, recognize that at some point, all negotiations become take it or leave it. There is a final point beyond which the other party will not cross. See figure 7.1. Earlier we have seen. Your best response to a premature or unwarranted take it or leave it threat is to downplay or ignore the implications of their stand. That is, when told to take a deal or walk away, try to rephrase or recast the positions in terms of a new point from which to continue bargaining. A building contractor speaking with a supplier may say, I understand that $1.5 is the lowest you believe you can go on a per square inch basis for the material. Now that we are looking at recasting our working relationship into a longer term proposition, I am sure you can see the advantages of both of us gaining a mutually acceptable price and delivery arrangement. Next is the pressure of delaying. Delay works only when one party is more time bound than the other. Some individuals use delay as tactics to increase the other side's tension and willingness to concede points. For example, refusing to return telephone calls or other contacts can make the other party pursue you. On the other hand, it is a fairly transparent tactic and can backfire, particularly if your opponent has other options available. It is also important to distinguish between delay and use of periodic timeouts. There is nothing wrong with using timeout in a negotiation. For example, new proposals or surprises offered at a negotiating session should always be always be followed by the other side taking time out to fully explore and consider them. Never take a deal that has just been placed on the table. Walk away and think about it. If the deal is genuine, it will still be there when you return. And if it is phony, the other party's pressure on you to make a quick decision is an obvious giveaway. Next is second bite of the apple. At the apple. Another common tactic involves the other side leaving themselves room to maneuver. Just when you think you have deal worked out, your opponent will say, well, this looks good to me. I just need to get formal approval from my boss before we can officially close it. Guess what? 9 times out of 10, this is a trick to walk away from the table only to return later with modified terms. Your opponent may couch the changes apologetically saying, I was ready to go for it, but my boss just had a couple of minor concerns. The second bite of the apple allows the other side to make maximum use of time and ambiguous lines of authority to work out the better deal. After all, if only you are in a position to make concessions, only you will make concessions. The best method for dealing with second bite at the apple is to set some ground rules prior to the negotiation. First, make sure the person sitting across the table from you has the authority to negotiate the deal. Ask them directly who has final decision authority. This puts them in a position of either acknowledging that they have it or admitting that someone else will have to make the decision. In the latter case, you may request future meetings include this decision maker to save time in transmitting positions. Under no circumstances should you allow yourself to commit to an agreement that the other side will not commit to at the same time. If this situation occurs, make it clear you are not bound by the agreement should it be changed. Rather, when or if they come back with changes, these will form the basis of the next round of negotiations. Deliberate deception and phony facts. Veteran negotiators often will admit they enjoy negotiating with brazen liars. This is because some of their exaggerations and stated positions are so outrageous that they are easily countered. The trick is to do your homework prior to the negotiation. For example, in negotiating with a car salesman who is making false claims about the cost of a new automobile, get a copy of the actual cost from Consumer Reports. Armed with this information, you are in a better position to catch the other party in some of their more obvious deceptions. Remember some important guidelines for dealing with deceptive negotiators. First, there is a difference between outright fraud and simply withholding information. No good negotiator is likely to lay all their cards on the table upfront. They want to see just how much you understand about the issue at hand. A good example happened recently while I was traveling in Europe. In purchasing a train ticket, the counterman held a fistful of bills and proceeded to count some out and drop them on the counter. He then paused and waited for a response. Remaining there and waiting for him to hand over all the change, avoided accusing him of fraud, or was he stealing? Had I picked up the change at that point, he would have pocketed the balance of the change that he was still holding. He was simply gauging my response to his opening position. The principle is the same in the business negotiations. It is your responsibility to recognize the difference between what your opponent chooses to tell you and the rest of the story. Your second defense is dealing with deceptive negotiators is equally simple. Do your homework. It is amazing the number of novice negotiators who walk into their first bargaining session with only a cursory understanding of their own positions, let alone any knowledge of the other party. The difference between a good chess player and an exceptional chess player is the latter is always anticipating several moves ahead. They know the game intimately and they understand the appropriate responses for most situations and moves. In doing your homework, remember to look beyond your opponent's positions and consider their interest. What is driving their behavior? The more you learn about the other side, the better your chances of correctly anticipating and responding to their moves. Finally, Fisher and Uri made an important point about trust. Essentially, they argue that unless you have compelled reasons to trust the other party, do not. That is not to suggest that you call them liar. Instead, you are attempting to separate the people from the problem. Your doubts about another party are not intended as a personal attack, nor should you allow the other side to frame them this way. Don't you trust me? I thought we had a good relationship here. Trust is a separate issue. You are working to make the best arrangement you can, just as you should reasonably assume that the other individual is working along similar lines. The more you make clear your willingness and intent to verify all factual information, particularly early in the negotiation, the greater the incentive for your opponent to provide you with legitimate information. Personal attacks. Some extremely successful negotiators have a very limited set of tactics for negotiation. Essentially, they operate under the belief the faster they can get the other party angry and emotional, the greater the chances. Just a moment, let me get. Okay, the greater the chances for securing some major concession. Because the other party is so anxious to end the negotiation, they walk away quickly, getting a mediocre deal with minimal effort. The use of personal attacks is blatant psychological manipulation and one of the dirtier negotiating tricks. Most of us are uncomfortable with negotiations. These bullies understand this and seek to capitalize on our hesitancy by pouring gasoline on the fire. Their reasoning is simple. The more unpleasant they make the process, the sooner you will capitulate and grant them the major points. The tactic of personal attack is very short sighted. No one engaging in mind games with a bully is anxious to do so again. Consequently, most abusive negotiators employ this tactic in situations involving one shot deals, where they can walk away secure in the knowledge that they have won and are likely to ever see the other party again. There are two responses to personal attacks. First is to recognize the tactic and refuse to allow yourself to be drawn into it. The longer you stay cool in the face of this sort of sniping, the sooner the other party will acknowledge its futility and call it off. The second option for handling abuse is to call your opponent on his or her behavior as it occurs. A writer on office politics once noted, leave no shot unanswered. This is not to suggest you return insult or innuendo in kind, but rather that you tell the other person you know what game he is playing and refuse to go along with it. What can we do in dealing with problem negotiators? Remember, all of these tactics are designed to throw you off your game. In each case, your opponent is using a method that he believes will secure him some advantage. It is not personal. Nevertheless, you do have some alternatives when these attacks occur. In addition to those mentioned, there are some general rules and guidelines that can make dealing with problem negotiators easier for everyone. So, in addition to whatever we have studied so far, we are talking about few more points. First of all, don't attack their position, look behind it. Recognize the basic motivations driving your opponent. This behavior is simply a physical manifestation of the deeper issues that underscore their negotiating position and behavior. Is ego driving them? A desire to succeed and look good for the boss? Is it a personal vendetta? Or is their behavior the result of their own inexperience? In framing your response, avoid getting into series of escalating exchanges with the other party. No one wins in a free-for-all, and from a negotiation standpoint, it is counterproductive. Directly assaulting their position only causes the other party to dig their heels in. Rather, make it clear you are seeking a mutually satisfying alternative, understanding their interests and working to address them. Next is recast an attack on you as an attack to the problem. Many people cannot understand a basic law of negotiation. The person is not the position. We make a mistake when we make the person across the table from us the physical manifestation of all that we object to in the other party's position, often framing them as the bad guys because of their espousal of those views. Consider, for example, the attitudes shared by many people about defense lawyers who many are convinced have no morality because of their willingness to defend any felon, no matter how reprehensible. Obviously, we are imparting all of our animus regarding crime in general, the court system, the justice system, law as a profession, and so forth on the lawyer. Fair or not, this individual becomes the scapegoat for our dissatisfaction. Many of us do the same thing in negotiations. The other side becomes a symbol of our opposing position, and so much we are tempted to develop supporting negative stereotypes about them as individuals. It is important to understand that we must look behind the individual to the position and to the underlying issues, that is, to seek ways to deflect the attack toward a mutually acceptable problem. When faced with personal attacks, rather than respond defensively, recast the attack onto the problem. When you say that you do not like my use of your subordinates on the project, I am hearing your concern that organizational resources be used as efficiently as possible. I want you to know that I share this concern. Could you give me some of your thoughts on how best to move the project through the system while using your people efficiently? So you see, he has rephrased the abuse into a statement, and there is further talking, further negotiation possible. Next is understand the use and advantages of silence. Silence makes most people uncomfortable. In certain situations, riding in an elevator, waiting for a bus, we often find ourselves engaging in the most mundane or superficial conversations with strangers in an effort to avoid the pain of silence. In fact, silence is a wonderful tool to negotiate better deals. When engaged in negotiations with another party, don't feel compelled to be the one to break the silence. Wait for the other party to initiate discussion. The result is often that you are now in a position of responding to their opening gambits or offers rather than having the onus of initiation placed on you. Silence is particularly useful when the other party is attempting to use personal attacks or extreme demands as a negotiating tactic, rather than respond, particularly when you are not sure what to say. Keep silent. Pretty silent, someone on the other side will put their own interpretation on your reticence, perhaps that you are offended, angry, or simply intractable, and adjust their position accordingly. A classic example of that tactic is a story about President Lyndon Johnson, who, when meeting Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin for the first time, proceeded to stare at him silently for well over a half hour until Kosygin was the first to break eye contact. Obviously, for most of us, silence does not have to constitute a battle of wills or a machismo display, nor is it always the best approach to take in principle negotiation. Nevertheless, many of us have discovered we can learn a great deal more and concede a great deal less when we listen rather than talk. So we summarize this chapter. Negotiation is a process that few of us relish. Project managers are no different. While their job often consists of a series of negotiations with clients, upper management, the project team, and other stakeholder groups, many have never thought to systematically develop a strategy for these negotiation processes. Further, once placed in the bargaining position, they refuse to acknowledge all the options available, perhaps preferring to follow tried and true methods, regardless of the fact that they may not be well tried or even true. Negotiation, in its basic sense, is a form of influence that is conducted around a formal goal. As it relates to influence and ultimately a project manager's political acumen, it is important to learn to better employ these techniques. The first step is an honest assessment of current deficiencies regarding negotiating. How would we honestly rate ourselves in this activity once we have an image in our mind of our proficiency or lack thereof? The second step is to begin examining precisely what our weak points are. Do we too quickly personalize a negotiation? Do we automatically assume all negotiations are win-lose? Do we look for underlying interests, or are we content to simply deal with positions? Finally, do we do our homework, or do we approach every negotiation as a real-time survival of the fittest? The answers to these questions will go a long way toward improving our negotiation abilities. So this brings us to the end of chapter 7, and we will be moving on to chapter 8, which is conflict and project management. But I will stop here for a while to discuss with you if you have any comments about the chapter of negotiation which we have just completed. Is there any point? जी प्लीज
सर ठीक है, अंडरस्टैंडेबल है जो आपने इसमें कोई बिकॉज द आइडियाज वर सिंपल और कोई ऐसी कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग चीज थी नहीं। नॉर्मल रूटीन प्रैक्टिस में चीजें इसी तरीके से आती हैं। ठीक ठीक, बिल्कुल बिल्कुल। और चूंकि कॉन्सेप्ट सिंपल है, इस वजह से आई थिंक डिस्कशन अभी नहीं, मैं इस वजह से नहीं करना चाह रहा बिकॉज क्योंकि चीजें क्लियर हैं। हाँ जी, तो ऐसा कोई पॉइंट मेरे आ भी नहीं था जिसको एडिशनली ऐड किया जा सके। सर बिल्कुल 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 सही। और वकार साहब आपकी तरफ से कुछ?
हाँ सर, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। नहीं सर ठीक है सर, बस ये है कि ये जो भी टेक्निक्स बताई हुई है ना, उनको हम कितना इस्तेमाल करते हैं, बस वो देखना है कि उसको जितना प्रैक्टिस में लेकर आएंगे उतना इफेक्टिव हमारी नेगोशिएशंस होंगी। वरना अगर हम यूज नहीं करेंगे, सिर्फ सुनते रहेंगे और सिर्फ बुक्स में पढ़ते रहेंगे, तो वो फिर इतना मतलब एफिशिएंटली हम यूज नहीं कर सकेंगे।
बिल्कुल, मैं इसीलिए तो हम पढ़ रहे हैं ताकि हम इनको एनालाइज करें और देखें हम क्या करते हैं और क्या नहीं करते। हो सकता है कि ये सब चीजें हम पहले से जानते हों, लेकिन एक खास स्ट्रक्चर में हमने कभी इनको देखा नहीं हो। तो लेट्स मूव ऑन।
मेरा पॉइंट एग्जांपल दी हुई थी जी, जस्ट अ पॉइंट सिर्फ। हेलो सर। जी जी
Yes,
अच्छा, मेरा पॉइंट भी सर ये था कि जो कॉन्सेप्ट जो अभी एक्सप्लेन हुए ना सर, तकरीबन 80 to 90% आई वुड से कि हम करते रहते हैं वन वे और दी अदर, डायरेक्टली या इनडायरेक्ट। लेकिन ये चीज है कि डेफिनेटली ये स्ट्रक्चर्ड तरीके से पढ़ना और फिर एक चीज का ना ऑथेंटिक तरीके से उसका ये पता, ये मेरा प्रॉब्लम पहली दफा पता लगा मुझे कि यार ये किताबों में भी ऐसे ही लिखा हुआ है। अदरवाइज तो जाहिर है सर 20-25 साल की प्रैक्टिकल लाइफ में कुछ ना कुछ ये चीजें लॉजिकली ऐसे होती हैं।
जी बिल्कुल होती हैं, बिल्कुल। थैंक यू जी, थैंक यू फॉर योर कमेंट्स। लेट्स स्टार्ट ऑफ टू द नेक्स्ट चैप्टर। Next chapter is chapter 8, and this is conflict and project management. There's a quotation written on top. It says, madness is the exception in individuals, but rule in groups. Project managers face conflict as part of their daily life from a number of sources, internal and external, and in dealing with other project stakeholders. One study estimated that the average manager spends over 20% of his or her time dealing with conflict. Project managers would likely suggest that the 20% figure understates the case. Conflict is often an offshoot of power struggles and political dynamics within an organization. Because so much of the project manager's time is taken up with active conflict and its aftermath, it is important to examine the process within the project management context. In the past, much has been written about the sources of conflict within the project management context. Little, however, is known or understood about the actual dynamics of the conflict process itself. That is, once a conflict occurs, what are some of the common responses and actions that are fairly predictable? This chapter explores the process of conflict, examines the various sources of conflict for project teams and managers, develops a model of conflict behavior, and fosters an understanding of some of the most common methods for de-escalating conflict. Many conflicts develop out of a basic lack of or unwillingness to understand another party's position. And once a conflict does occur, either within or outside of the project team, project managers who are aware of the various actions, alternatives they can employ. They can employ, have a real opportunity, or not only diffuse conflict, but also to learn valuable lessons from the episode. Understanding these issues will improve project managers' use of power, make them better at their job, reduce stress, and enhance the team environment. So, what is conflict? One of the best definitions of conflict suggests it is the process that begins with when one perceives that one or more others have frustrated or are about to frustrate a major concern of theirs. There are two important elements in this definition. First, it suggests that conflict is not a state per se, but a process. As such, it contains a very important dynamic aspect. Conflicts evolve. Further, the one-time causes of a conflict may change over time, and that is, the reasons why a conflict started between two individuals or groups may no longer be valid. However, because the conflict state is dynamic and evolving, once a conflict has occurred, the reasons behind it may no longer matter. Second, conflict is perpetual in nature. It does not ultimately matter whether or not one party has truly frustrated another party. The key is that one party perceives that state or event to have occurred. That perception is enough, because for the first party, perception of frustration defines their reality. So, two people who are having a conflict, they could have their own realities. They should think that they are winning, and still the fight is going on. Sources of conflict. There are an enormous number of potential sources of conflict. Some of the most common include competition for scarce resources, violation of group or organizational norms, disagreements over goals or means to achieve those goals, personal slights and threats to job security, long-held biases and prejudices, and so forth. Many of the sources of conflict arise from the positions of managers or the nature of the work they do. Another equally compelling set of causes also stem from the individuals themselves, that is, their own psychological process contribute to the level and amount of conflict within an organization. One useful method of looking at the causes of conflict is to separate the organizational and interpersonal causes of conflict. Organizational sources of conflict. Let's discuss them first. Some of the most common organizational causes of conflict include reward systems, scarce resources, uncertainty over lines of authority, and differentiation. Reward systems are often a source of conflict because in some organizations there are in place competitive reward systems that pit one group or functional department against other. When functional managers, for example, are evaluated on the performance of their subordinates, they are loath to best workers to become involved in project work. The organization may have unwittingly created a situation where functions perceive that either the project team or the department, not both, will be rewarded for superior performance. In such cases, they will naturally retain their best people for functional duties and offer less desirable subordinates for project team work. The project managers, on the other hand, will also perceive a competition between their projects and the functional department and develop a strong sense of animosity toward the functional managers who they perceive with some justification are putting their interest above the organization. By its very nature, a project generates significant differences of opinion on how scarce resources, particularly personnel and money, may be used. Project managers face an ongoing battle with functional managers to get the resources needed for a successful project. This easily leads to confrontation not only between project manager and the department head, but also between the functional managers who know one or more of them will lose resources. Uncertainty over lines of authority asks the tongue-in-cheek question, who is in charge around here? In the project environment, it is easy to see how this problem can be exacerbated due to the ambiguity that exists in terms of formal channels of authority. Project managers and their teams sit outside the formal organizational hierarchy in many organizations. As a result, they find themselves in a uniquely fragile position of having a great deal of autonomy, but also responsible to the functional department heads who provide the personnel for the team. When a project team member from R&D, for example, is given orders by a functional manager that subsume or directly contradict directives from the project manager, the team member is placed in the dilemma of finding, if possible, a middle ground between two authority figures. In many cases, project managers do not have the authority to prepare performance evaluations of team members. That control is kept within the functional department. In such situations, the team member from R&D facing role conflict brought on by his uncertainty over lines of authority will most likely do the expedient thing and obey functional managers because of the power of the performance appraisal. The final source of organizational conflict, differentiation, suggests that as individuals join an organization within some functional specialty, they begin to adopt the attitudes and outlook of that functional group. For example, when asked for an opinion of marketing, a member of the finance department might reply, all they ever do is travel around and spend money. They are a bunch of cowboys who would give away the store if they have to. Marketing's response would follow along the lines of, finance people are just a group of bean counters who don't understand that the company is only as successful as it can sell its products. They are so hung up on their margins They don't know what goes on in the real world. Now, the important point in each of these views is that within their narrow frames of reference, they are both essentially correct. Marketing is interested primarily in making sales, and finance is devoted to maintaining high margins. These options, however, are by no means completely true. Instead, they reflect the underlying attitude and prejudices of members of both functional departments. The more profound the differentiation within an organization, the greater the likelihood of individuals and groups dividing up into us versus them encampments which continue to promote and provoke conflict. Next is interpersonal causes of conflict. In addition to these organizational causes of conflict, consider also some of the salient interpersonal causes. While by no means a comprehensive list, among these interpersonal sources of conflict are faulty attributions, faulty communication, grudges, and prejudices. Faulty attributes refers to misconceptions of the reasons behind another's behavior. When people perceive their interests have been thwarted by another individual or group, they typically try to determine why the other party acted as they did. In making attributions about another's actions, we try to determine if their motives are based on personal malevolence, hidden agenda, or so forth. Often, groups and individuals will attribute motives to others' actions that are personally most convenient. When one member of a project team, for example, has his or her wishes frustrated, it is common to perceive the motives behind the other party's actions in terms of the most convenient causes. In other words, rather than acknowledge that reasonable people may differ in their opinion, the frustrated person may assume the other is provoking a conflict for personal reasons. He just doesn't like me. This attribution is convenient for an obvious psychological safe reason. If we assume the other person disagrees with us for valid reason, it implies a flaw in our position. Many individuals do not have the ego strength to acknowledge and accept objective disagreement, preferring to couch their frustration on personal terms. A very common interpersonal cause of conflict stems from faulty communication. This implies a potential for two mistakes. Number one, communicating in ambiguous ways, which leads to different interpretations, resulting in conflict. And number two, unintentionally communicating in ways that annoy or anger other parties. Lack of clarity sends out mixed signals. Some will understand the message the sender intended to communicate, others will interpret it differently. Consequently, a project manager may be surprised and annoyed by a subordinate's work, while the subordinate may genuinely think he or she is adhering to the project manager's desires. Likewise, project managers often engage in criticism, hoping to correct and improve a project team member's performance. Unfortunately, what the project manager may consider to be harmless, constructive criticism may come across as a destructive, unfair critique if the information is not communicated accurately and effectively. Interpersonal conflicts refers to the personal grudges and prejudices that each of us brings to any work situation. These attitudes arise as a result of long-term experiences or lessons taught at some point in the past, often unconsciously held. We may be unaware we nurture those attitudes and may feel a genuine sense of affront when we are challenged or accused of holding biases. Nevertheless, these grudges or prejudices, whether they are held against another race, sex, or functional department, have a seriously debilitating effect on our ability to work with others in a purposeful team and can ruin any chance of project team cohesion and subsequent project performance. Steps in the conflict process. Next heading. Regardless of the triggering cause, once conflict either intra or intergroup have begun, they tend to follow a rather well-defined pattern. It is useful for project managers to be aware of their pattern because it serves as a template to recognize various conflict dynamics. If the nature of the conflict process is understood as it progresses, one is in a better position to search for methods to diffuse and minimize the conflict or channel its energies into more constructive pastimes. In this section, we examine the stages in the conflict process and offer some suggestions for project managers on how to most effectively deal with the conflict dynamics that often emerge. Typically, there are five recognizable stages in the conflict process: frustration, conceptualization, orientation, interaction, and outcome. First, talking about frustration, the first stage of any conflict process is triggered by an event that sets on or more people at odds. As suggested in the original definition of conflict, this event is referred to as perceived frustration. Frustration comes in many forms and approaches. Earlier, we identified several sources of frustration and classified them into two categories: organizational and interpersonal. The important point to remember is that frustrations occur in everyone's life on a daily basis. Therefore, there must be some reason why we respond to certain frustrations in a confrontational manner but not to others. Often, this choice is predicated on our perception of how important the issue is to us. Under normal circumstances, a traffic jam would be a source of frustration, but we would rarely deem it serious enough to actively confront the city administration over the issue. On the other hand, in situations that involve slights to status, promotion possibilities, or public image, we tend to react to frustrations more directly. It is these situations where we attach a level of importance to the frustrated goal when we are most likely to respond in an aggressive and competitive manner. Conceptualization. Conceptualization means defining the issues underlying the source of conflict, analyze why a conflict is occurring between ourselves and our team, or with someone else, and an interesting psychological process begins to occur. We see the conflict through the lens of egocentricity. Egocentricity refers to predilection of most people to define issues solely in terms of their own concerns. When confronted with a situation in which we feel frustrated by another individual, we respond in a way that does not recognize the other party's perspective. That is, we perceive the other person is thwarting us without considering their point of view or why they are acting in a particular way. The clear alternative to analyzing frustration in terms of egocentricity is to develop insight into the other party's concerns. Remember, never judge another person unless you have walked a mile in their shoes. Unless another person's motives, intent, and past experiences are understood, we cannot objectively address the nature of the conflict. Rather, we will continue to be inclined to respond with an egocentric approach that only further solidifies the lines that separate the rival parties' positions. Attempting to gain this insight into the underlying issues involves refusing to capitulate to the initial sense of frustration with another party and search for reasons why that person or group is operating the way they are. It is this search for the answers to why that will diffuse many conflicts before they escalate. It requires the project manager or team member to be able to forego the appeals of egocentricity and try and analyze the problem from the other party's perspective. Depending upon the nature and degree of conflict, this rational objectivity can be very difficult, but well worth the effort. If we halt conflicts at this stage, many of the problems that would continually plague the project team throughout the project can be avoided. Next is orientation. Orientation is the outlook we begin to adopt as a conflict episode continues to escalate. Thomas and Rubble and Thomas argue that conflict orientation generally involves operating along two separate dimensions of concern. One, the degree to which one party seeks to satisfy their own concerns. Two, the degree to which a party seeks to satisfy the other person's concern. Figure 8.1 on the next page I'll shows Rubble and Thomas conceptualization of this two-dimensional model of conflict orientation. I just show you. So this is on the x-axis you find desire to satisfy other parties' concerns, this is low to high, and desire to satisfy own concerns, low to high. So how much have you both of these desires? Let's get back and explain that. Okay. They argue we make implicit trade-offs in our willingness to seek our gains versus our willingness to satisfy the other party to the conflict. They further posit that the underlying motive deriving these two dimensions is our desire to be assertive and gain maximum advantage while being cooperative with the other party in order to maintain satisfactory relationship. Within this two-dimensional model of conflict orientation and behavior, Thomas suggests 5 distinct and recognizable types of conflict behavior are potentially possible: competing, accommodating, avoiding, compromising, and collaborating. The decision of which type of behavior to engage in resides solely with the party who is conceptualizing the nature and reasons of the conflict. Figure 8.2 shows each of the 5 conflict handling styles. Let me take you to that page. If you can look at it, here it has placed all these 5 potentially possible behaviors onto the same graph. And here we have compromising in the center. Avoiding is low in desire to satisfy others and low in desire to satisfy own self. Collaborating is the best, it is high on both sides. Accommodating is high on satisfying the other party and low on our own desire. And competing is high on our desire and low on the other party's desire. Getting back to where we were. Okay. Competing behavior is basically assertive and uncooperative. Someone adopting a competing style has no regard for satisfying the other party's concern, viewing conflict as a win-lose proposition in which they have resolved not to lose. Competing behavior is often used by insecure or power-hungry people who will use every technique and trick to get their way. It is often ironic to find the individuals who are high on the competing dimension have great difficulty in operating under any other style, no matter what the nature of the conflict. For example, highly competitive people take issues of resource allocation and the result of game of gin rummy with the same degree of intensity. They cannot distinguish between important conflicts and unimportant conflicts. Indeed, the very existence of a concept such as an unimportant conflict is alien to their way of thinking. At the opposite extreme from competing behavior in the accommodating style, as in figure 8.2 shows, accommodators enter conflict from the perspective of seeking to first satisfy the other party's concern. Accommodators foster non-assertive and cooperative styles, usually in an effort to be true team player. They are quick to look for ways to diffuse a situation or to allow the other party to win. The accommodating style can be useful when the issue of concern is seen as more important for the other side than for the accommodator. It may serve as an important goodwill gesture or a basis for storing up behavior favors the manager may need at a later point. If overused, however, the accommodating style tends to create passivity in a project manager, a state which can deprive subordinates or peers of useful viewpoints and contributions. The avoiding style, which is low on both sides, is one that is both unassertive and uncooperative. Individuals who rely on the avoiding style manifest no desire to either satisfy their concern or the concern of the other party to the conflict. Avoiding tends to be an effective method for sidestepping a conflict that one party does not seek. It is a style of organizational diplomats and politicians who perceive they can accomplish more if they operate behind the scenes rather than in the open in conflict with another party. Compromising behavior falls somewhere in between assertive and cooperative behavior. It is a desire by one party to satisfy some of their, their concerns and a willingness to give in on other points. A compromiser sees conflict as a win-lose situation and believes that in order to get something, it is necessary to give up something. A compromising style tacitly acknowledges the importance of making concessions to gain something from the conflict. As a result, while compromisers see conflict in terms of winners and losers, they generally feel that each party can win a little and lose a little. Collaborating behaviors rates high in both assertiveness and cooperativeness. Collaborators view conflict from a very different perspective than most managers in that they reject the win-lose argument most of us believe underlies conflict, always seeking a win-win solution to achieve such an outcome. Collaborators readily work with the other party to see if it is possible to find a solution that fully satisfies both sides. This sort of joint problem solving requires a great deal of flexibility, creativity, precise communication between the parties in conflict. A collaborating style is usually necessary when the issue at hand is too important to be solved with a compromising approach. In situations when project leaders are seeking to make major product specifications changes or determine resource allocation, they may be faced with two or more distinct alternatives. Rather than vainly attempt to satisfy their disparate viewpoints by offering a compromise that will please no one and do nothing to further the development of the project, these managers may hold a series of project team meetings to put all positions on the table where they can be addressed in a problem solving session. The result of this meeting may be a new strategic focus for the project with new tasks and responsibilities for each team member. In this meeting, the problem underlying the conflict could not be ignored. Further, allowing one team member to dominate the others with a competing style could potentially result in the incorrect decision. The best alternative for the project manager is to find, in collaboration with the project team, a solution that offers a win-win alternative. Because no one conflict handling style is appropriate in every situation, insightful project managers develop flexibility in their approaches to dealing with conflicts, either their own or those of team members within the group. The benefits of a collaborative style is that, unlike competing or avoiding, collaborative style emphasizes group relationships. Using this style offers a method for enhancing communication and creative problem solving. In doing so, a collaborating approach can bring a team in conflict closer together, rather than driving them further apart by solidifying the conflict situation. Interaction. Once a conflict episode escalates, a number of different exchanges begin to occur between the two parties in conflict. This exchange process is referred to as conflict interaction. While there are many actions conflicting parties can take during this process, our focus is on some of the more common dynamics of group conflict during this stage. One common occurrence, usually early in the conflict, is reinforcement through stereotypes. When another party is frustrating a goal we value, we often respond by attributing their intransigence to convenient and often incorrect motives. For example, in a budgeting dispute with a project accountant, a project manager may react by saying, "What can you expect from a group of unimaginative bean counters?" This action, while common, underscores the potential for reinforcing the disagreement by creating a self-serving stereotype of the other party. In this process, all opponents are selfish, willfully ignorant, or malicious because these attributions allow us to hold the high ground in the dispute. Through stereotyping other professions, cultures, races, or other opposite sex, we create a cause for discontent without being forced to re-examine our motives as a potential contributor to the conflict. As the name of this process suggests, rather than attempting to diffuse or suppress tension, the first inclination is to reinforce the conflict, making it that much more difficult to correct. Another process likely during interaction phase is one in which conflict begins to heighten feelings of positive identification with one's own group. There is a tendency when we perceive a conflict with an external stakeholder to close ranks and become more single-minded in our attitudes and dispositions. As a result of that process, it is common for groups to develop a superiority complex vis-a-vis other groups. This superiority complex feeds our inclination to regard our position as sacrosanct and justified as opposed to the devious and malicious inclined opponents. On the national level, the positive identification dynamic occurs quite frequently. For instance, in the early 80s, just prior to the Falkland War with Great Britain, Argentina war is in a state of tremendous political turmoil. Crowds in Buenos Aires and other large cities continually protested the right-wing rule of the military junta that controlled the government until Argentina invaded Falklands and created an external foe. Overnight, the crowd that had been demonstrating against the government became vast throngs supporting their leader, united in their opposition to Great Britain. This is an example of the positive identification effect that occurs in the face of the external conflict. Another dynamic likely during the action phase is exaggerating the positive nature of your group and its members, and distorting and exaggerating differences between our group and the opponent. Once we find ourselves in a conflict situation, there is pressure to conform to group norms, swallow internal differences, and deny any degree of similarity with the opposing group. This separation solidifies differences, making it harder for the group to seek common ground. In fact, we actively avoid the potential for identifying commonalities, preferring to focus on the differences and the reasons that justify our beliefs. I think that is enough for our 1 hour. I am left with almost, I think it's just 15 pages or even less. And we will be able to conclude this tomorrow, maybe in half an hour or 45 minutes. And we can have a little discussion on the whole book at the end of the session. And tomorrow we will naturally be finishing this book. And I have already announced what is the next book we are going to be studying. I will introduce that book tomorrow. And if some of you are interested, you can join me in the narration of that book also. But that is slightly more project management oriented and more agile, more technical. So if at all you are interested or anyone else is interested, probably you can guide them to that session. We are starting that session on 17th of July. So we'll have a little break after tomorrow, and on 17th we will start. That is the large book, 400 pages. So it will go on for 20 days or so. Anyways, on this book and so far what we have studied, what we have read, first of all, I would like to ask you, is it all clear? I mean, first of all, my narration, is it clear? Number two, have you understood everything? Yes, please.
So narration is fine. And if you're asking understanding, yes, understanding is like 60 to 70% is there definitely, but maybe some of the things we just have to go through maybe one more time for some things. That's it. But majority of the things are very clear.
Okay, the book is available to download from here. I don't
Yes,
know
sir.
if you have downloaded it or not. You can read it in your own convenience. जी आशीष.
Right, sir.
जी सर मेरा कमेंट ये है कि नरेशन तो आपकी सर नरेशन तो बहुत क्लियर है
सर.
मतलब जहां तक यानी आपकी इवन वॉइस क्वालिटी भी अमेजिंगली बड़ी अच्छी है नॉर्मली क्या कहते हैं जो हमारी रेगुलर क्लासेस होती हैं उसमें तो कभी कई दफा चीजें थोड़ी राइट लेफ्ट होती हैं लेकिन वॉइस क्वालिटी बड़ी अच्छी है 1 घंटा मतलब मसला ही नहीं हुआ बिल्कुल आपकी आवाज बिल्कुल क्लियर आती रही एक्सप्रेशन तो माशाल्लाह आपका वैसे ही अच्छा है यानी इंग्लिश आपकी जिस हिसाब किताब से आप बोल रहे होते हैं तो कोई मसला मसाइल बिल्कुल नहीं होता हाँ और आज ओवरऑल जो जहां तक बुक के कॉन्सेप्ट की बात है मेरी अपनी सर जो मेरा जाती ख्याल ये है कि चूंकि ये चीजें जरा कॉमन सेंस की थी जब मुझे लगा ये कि ज्यादातर ये सिचुएशंस मैंने प्रैक्टिकल लाइफ में फेस की हुई हैं छोटे मोटे प्रोजेक्ट्स आपको पता ही है सर फोर्सेस में भी पब्लिक प्राइवेट सेक्टर में होते रहते हैं चाहे फॉर्मल ना भी हो लेकिन प्रोजेक्ट्स ही होते हैं हर रोज कोई ना कोई नई चीज आ जाती है ये कॉन्फ्लिक्ट की रेजोल्यूशन और ये जो आपने जैसे कोलैबोरेटिंग का बताया सर और इसके अलावा ये जो वो क्या कहते हैं जो 5 वाले थे और ये दैट वाज लॉजिकल ये बड़ी अच्छी मुझे मतलब इट वाज क्वाइट अपीलिंग ये जो आपने कोलैबोरेटिव के बारे में किया है तो आई थिंक ठीक है मेरे हिसाब में सर अराउंड 80-85% अंडरस्टैंडिंग लेवल है सर किताब का अंडरस्टैंडिंग लेवल नहीं है वो शायद मेरे केस में स्पेस से हुआ होगा कि शायद मैंने उस टाइम पे जरा बीच में कंसंट्रेट ना कर सका हूं या मैं भी और चीज सोच रहा हूं दैट कुड बी द रीजन सर
बिल्कुल
ओवरऑल इट वाज गुड एक्सपीरियंस सर
बुक आपने डाउनलोड तो की हुई है
जी सर वो बुक तो अवेलेबल है सर बिल्कुल सर
आप ऑन योर ओन इसको चीजें
लेकिन वो सर सच्ची बात ये है कि वो जिस तरह आपने पढ़ा दी है ना सर तो दोबारा पढ़ना चले जरूर पढ़ लेनी चाहिए जाहिर है कोई हफ्ते 10 दिन बाद कोई ऐसी चीज जो रह गई होगी लेकिन आपने काफी सारी चीजें बड़े तरीके से वो समझा दी हैं तो आई थिंक इंशाल्लाह इट वैल्यू एडिशन बुक है हमारे पास सर
जबरदस्त चलें सर इंशाल्लाह कल हम खत्म करते हैं इसको फिर आप मजीद डिस्कशन भी होगी और फिर देखते हैं आगे क्या प्लान बनता है मगर मेरा इरादा ये है कि अभी मैं ये बुक्स पढ़ता रहूंगा
सर बड़ा वैसे सच्ची बात तो ये है कि आई वाज डिस्कसिंग इट विद माय अदर फ्रेंड्स आल्सो बड़ी कमिटमेंट है सर वैसे आपका जो है ना मुझे पता यू हैव अ वेरी बिजी शेड्यूल और उसमें जब तक किसी बंदे को खबत ना हो सर एक मतलब पर्टिकुलर डोमेन में नॉलेज गेन करने का और नॉलेज बांटने का तो 1 घंटा सर बोलना मुसलसल जो है ना सर लेक्चर लेना और बात है बंदा पॉज भी लेता है ये पढ़ना और वो भी अच्छे तरीके से पढ़ना समझाना भी ग्राफ भी बीच में आ जाते हैं बीच में और भी चीजें आ जाती हैं बड़ी कमिटमेंट की बात है अप्रिशिएट सर अप्रिशिएट
थैंक यू वेरी मच थैंक यू सर टेक केयर देन खुदा हाफिज सी यू नेक्स्ट
सर बहुत शुक्रिया सर थैंक यू
टेक केयर
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर गुड नाइट